Welcome, everyone. Today we're speaking to another of the authors from the forthcoming book, Deconstructing Whiteness, Empire and Mission. And so today we'll be talking to Kevin Snyman. And could you please introduce yourself, please, Kevin?
Hello to everybody. My name is the Reverend Dr. Kevin Snyman. I currently work at Church House of the United Reformed Church. I work as the Program Officer for Global Justice and Partnerships, and I have oversight for the denomination's Global Justice Program. It's called Commitment for Life. We work in close partnership with Christian Aid and Global Justice Now. And I also tend to give some input into the team's work around racial justice, the legacies of the transatlantic slave trade, and I have an input into our interfaith work amongst various religions in the UK.
Thank you, Kevin. So could you describe what your chapter's about?
Well, I hope it's a blueprint for a revolution, because my chapter wrestles with the question of how we firstly can recognize the system of oppression to which we've all become so accustomed that we don't even recognize them as oppressive anymore. And then secondly, how we begin the artist's journey of coming out of the bondage of those systems in order to journey towards God's promised land. I suggest in the chapter that what the Council for World Mission and others call the systems of domination or the systems of empire, these are quite literally destroying humanity as a consequence of empire, and they are manifesting themselves in the climate crisis at the moment. I then sit at the feet of Black liberation theology in order to learn the powerful lessons that it has around its methodology and has offered me in my journey of confronting my largely unconscious white privilege, and then apply those to confronting the systems of empire to which we are all subject.
Okay, so what made you take this particular approach to writing your chapter?
Right, so there's a bit of biography, obviously. But before we get to that, I suppose the thing that really vexes me at the moment is the way that the economic systems of empire, how they suck the wealth from the planet and from the poor, and then push them upwards up the hierarchy to the top. And in the process, they destroy ecosystems and they destroy communities, and they enslave us all actually under the power of what Jesus called mammon. And mammon goes about privatizing, commodifying, monetizing, and then selling off God's abundance. And it does so by introducing artificial scarcity. And the consequence of this devastation on the planet is now having global effects, as is witnessed by this fast approaching, if not already arrived, climate catastrophe. And I think what alarms me is that Jesus' warning to the followers, the warning about empire and its economic are not very well understood, and particularly around the question of debt that so occupied this Galilean rabbi. And we see this played out in the prayer that Jesus taught to the disciples. In fact, quite the reverse. Christians, like most other people, have come to believe that if you just throw enough money at injustice, it will go away. Whereas Jesus's point is that the kingdom of justice can never be realized through the mechanisms of empire. I mean, that was the lesson of the temptations in the desert. So my realization is that a little bit like my white privilege, empire is also rooted so deeply within me that it remains largely unseen. And I wanted to try and cast light on that fact.
Thank you for that. So what would you say has shaped your social conscience?
So you might be able to tell, Carol, from the accent, I grew up in South Africa. What you may not know is that I was a member of a mainline denomination that when I was growing up in the church almost never spoke out against the evils of apartheid. I mean, can you imagine that? Mm-hmm. I mean, at least there may have been those in the denomination, and I found out many years later there were who used to speak out, but they were very efficiently sidelined by the prevailing theologies of the time in the church, as well as the polity and the structures of the church, so that ordinary members like me sitting each Sunday in the pew trying to make Jesus our Lord and Savior, all the while my black siblings in the township next door were being murdered by conscripted white boys, and some of them were my schoolmates. So this, by the way, schoolmates in my white-only school. So this sidelining of Black liberation theology that was going on there is still happening even in the UK today. Anthony might have something to say about that. And I point that out in my chapter. And we still see that even in my denomination. But we also see that there have been some fairly impressive inroads that have been made by Black theologians. Think of James Cone, think of Anthony Reddie, think of Tracy Blackaman, Clippy Skritzinger, South African, and Roderick Hewitt from the Caribbean. And I think it's the hope that this sparked in me, the inroads and the effectiveness of Black liberation theology in unmasking white privilege, that encouraged me to begin to apply that liberated praxis to unmasking the multiple layers of empire that shape you and me and every member of our community.
Okay, thank you. So moving on from that, what do you think are the biggest challenges to the church and wider society in terms of creating spaces for social justice, platforms for social justice?
Right. I mean, there's a question that I'm constantly wrestling with this because of my role for the church, and of course I try to apply these criteria in everything I do. But I think for me the most pressing and fundamentally existentially threatening issue right now is the climate catastrophe that has arrived, and I don't think that humanity can effectively address the question of climate chaos until we have abandoned the tools of empire. And in my paper, I call these the unholy trinity of empire, and I kind of map those out. But one of these tools, or one of these persons, these unholy persons, of course, is what Jesus called mammon, or is the debt-based, interest-bearing monetary architecture of empire. But most of us simply just know it as business as usual. And so part of the difficulty that money and the assumptions around money, that these are so thoroughly embedded in our language, they're embedded in our thoughts, our assumptions, our actions, they are even embedded in our concepts of God, according to Richard Seaford. In other words, we've been so thoroughly shaped by the assumptions of debt and of interest and of money that actually it's affected our ability to imagine alternatives. These alternatives have been actually worked out of us. And so when we do try to solve problems, we end up almost creating the very problems we're trying to solve because we don't know what the alternative is. We don't even know that we don't know very often. And so what we tend to do is we tend to use money. I mean, this is what my project does. We tend to use money to solve the problems that money itself has caused. It's very ironic, isn't it? So I try to put it like this. Just imagine there's a raging diesel fire, and we come along with and we begin dousing that fire with fine mists of diesel spray in the hope of putting out the inferno. That's what it's like trying to throw money at a problem that money has caused, which is in fact, again, the stripping of wealth from the poor and shifting up to the rich. That's the mechanism. That's what it was designed to do 5,000 years ago, and that's what it's still doing. And we don't even know that it's doing that. We're mostly unaware. So a little bit like my white privilege, I was unaware that that's what the monetary system does of empire. So what I'm saying is that our actions, when we try to act to mitigate or to address the climate crisis, we end up making it worse because we don't recognize what the core problem is. It's a little bit like me taking control of the narrative of how Black people ought to feel, how they really ought to feel in the context of white privilege. That's effectively the analogy, I think.
Okay, there's a lot there to think about. Okay, so just to finish, what do you hope people will take away from reading your chapter?
So what I'm hoping is that those who read the chapter will go away and do a little bit more of research into things like Black liberation theology and to examine and understand how Black liberation theology works in unmasking and not only unmasking, but also subverting the systems of white privilege. It really has a great methodology and it's fantastic. And we all know, we all kind of, if we work in the church environment, we're all kind of thinking, well, what is the best I had a chat with Roger Hallam last night, and we were talking about how you shift churches into truly facing the question of the climate crisis and not hide away. How do you shift, institutions? It's a really big question. I think Black liberation has a methodology. And what I'd like to do is for us to apply these lessons to ourselves within our own inner lives, our own spiritual lives, our own lives in the world, into our churches, into our communities, and apply that to the mechanisms that empire uses to dominate us and to control us. And in fact, we assume they're so natural to us that we just think that they are normal. We've internalized these mechanisms to the point that they're invisible to us. So my hope is that we will all become still enough to allow empire to be unmasked in us, and then have the courage and the wisdom to discover genuine alternatives to empire, not just propagate, repeat empire because we don't know any better. And I want to suggest that's what Jesus hoped we would do as the church. Jesus hoped that we would recognize and come out of empire, and that we would build an alternative community of abundance and of hope, of equality and of love. And I want to say, and I'll end with this, I think if we don't risk this, if we don't risk doing that, we have a genuine threat of losing human life on this planet in just a few short decades. I don't think that the stakes could possibly be higher, Carol.
Yeah. There's a lot of challenging stuff there, I think, that people will hopefully engage with. So thank you for sharing your thoughts today. And I'm sure people will look forward to reading your chapter.
Thank you very much, Carol, and blessings to you and to everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.